All right. Looks like we're live. So really excited for this discussion. Honestly, I've been kind of like following along and a fan of what Max has been doing for a long time before I got into Web3. Um, he is the creator of Homebrew. He's also doing a lot of like cool stuff, and he has some really interesting stories. I want to highlight one of them, which is kind of how I started following him in the first place a few years ago. But before I do that, I guess I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nada. Yeah, well, if we go all the way back, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with myself career-wise. I remember going to a career fair when I was 16 back in Britain. Don't live there anymore, but that's where I was born and raised, South London. And I remember only one thing about it, that I met the two programmers who were there shilling the art of programming, and they scared me. I did not find I resonated with how they were. I was like a teenager, and I was didn't want to be seen as a geek. So did not choose programming. Ended up doing chemistry. Got a master's in chemistry, and it was while I was doing that I realized that actually I hated chemistry. It's boring, and I went home in a sort of depressed funk and installed Linux on my home computer, and that's how I discovered open source. Found all the open source communities that were busy trying to change the world, and I was like, changing the world. That sounds like something I'd be more interested in than mixing some molecules in a flask and trying to measure the surface tension of things. This was like, I don't know, 2003 or so. So I got into open source, started building apps and things, moved back in with my parents, didn't know what I was doing with my life. They kicked me out of the house, and coincidentally managed to get a invitation to interview at some London startup. So I got into the tech industry via open source. And so, open source has always been my thing, is the truth of it. I've been doing it more than 20 years at this point. It was while I was at that first company that I created, Homebrew, which, gonna be hard pushed to do a bigger project than Homebrew in my life. It's probably 50, 60 million people use it on a day-to-day basis now. But I spent years working on that, evenings, weekends, dedicating myself to what really felt like just the most interesting thing that I could possibly do, the most value I could give to the world at the time. And it was like basically my career has been one of doing open source and trying to figure out how to do open source. Like it's a well-known problem, obviously, that open source, especially now, like in the 20 years that I've been doing it, it went from being something that everyone thought was kind of a joke. Like if you can, I'm not sure how long you've been in this in like with open source, Native, but like when I first got into it, everyone thought it was a bunch of hippies were making it, and you couldn't trust it, and it was just nonsense. And Linux, well, no one's going to use Linux. Like, what would you use Linux for? Like, what, you pay Microsoft for Windows, don't you? Well, it comes free with your computer. Why would you use Linux,
Yeah,
etc.?
I think I came in on the tail end of all of that stuff. There was a little bit of that, but I think I got dropped into the middle of some people that were very bullish and all in on open source early on in LA, and I was fortunate for that.
Yep, like that's the community I discovered. And then when I looked on the other side, and it's like Microsoft were busy trying to destroy it at the time. Like, it's hard to believe now, obviously, like Microsoft are full on with open source, but at the time they were scared of it. There was a lot of big business that was really scared of it. But it was Web 2 that really turned open source into what it is now, which is like the base of everything software wise. Like open source, some of the open source I've written, it's been to Mars. It's it's everywhere in every computer and every phone on the planet. It's just incredibly rare not to find some aspect of it in any software you use. Like, honestly, I wouldn't trust it if I came across some software that had no open source in it whatsoever. Yeah, stay clear of that. But in the last 15, 20 years, as it became like instrumental and foundational to all software, a lot of people made a lot of money building on top of open source, but it is very, very rare for that value to trickle back in any capacity. And I say it all the time, like people like myself who've built important open source, we never did it for money. We never did it because we were expecting anything.
Right.
But the the problem comes when it's just so important and like the whole world is dependent on this
Yeah,
stuff, and then you got
absolutely. I mean,
people.
like if you build
Yeah,
something and you're the one using it for yourself and you just open source it and no one's really kind of like, I would say, building a billion-dollar company on top of it, so it's not that important for them, then obviously you're not gonna want to get paid for that. But once you have millions of teams, or okay, let's not say millions, let's say probably tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of teams using a product, and then they start submitting like GitHub issues, demanding things.
yeah,
That's when the
yeah.
discussion makes a lot of people, become very opinionated. A lot of us think that those people deserve to get paid relative to the amount of value that they're creating. And some people think that, oh, they just created it, it's free.
Mhm.
Let them continue like updating it. I'm gonna tip them $10 and I'm gonna go about my day.
Yeah, exactly. I'll buy them a coffee kind of situation, right? Like that's what most open source maintainers is the most they can really expect. Like I've had a few coffees bought for me in my time, um, and that's what I came to understand. Like doing this career where I was continuously doing open source, and then I run out of money and have to get a contract, get a job. I had a few stints here and there. Obviously, the Google story is a good one, and I worked at Apple for a bit as well. And like the open source I did open doors for me, but that wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to work on open source full time. Like I spent probably 18 months overall full time on Homebrew, and which is interesting because I didn't know that that was so common, right? I spoke to Isaacs, the creator of npm, the other day. I've been talking to a lot of really core open source developers over the last 6 to 12 months because of T, which we will eventually talk about. And he said that if he hadn't dedicated 12 months initially to npm full time, right? I didn't ask him how he funded that, then npm wouldn't have existed. Right? It just couldn't have existed if he hadn't been able to dedicate that time. So yeah, like we all know there's like loads of problems with how open source works. Like somehow it works. I argue that open source powers the world now. So how much further ahead would we be as a species, where like the most important part of our technology nowadays is easily software. Software is where everything is being innovated. Like, how much further ahead would we be if the people like myself who work on open source could do it full time for a start? But
Right.
also, it's getting to a crux. Like just what was it last month, the XZ issue, where it was basically a classic situation where the maintainer burned out and passed it on to someone he thought that he could trust. And actually, the person was not trustworthy and put a massive backdoor in it. And it was a fundamental piece of open source software. And this is too much is dependent on the security of our open source now, and there is just nothing really buoying that up whatsoever. So yeah, like huge problems, and that's why I founded T Protocol a couple of years ago now.
Can you talk about your Google story? Because that was the funniest and also saddest, like, or not saddest, like funniest, but like also very ironic, I would say, laughs that I'd had when I read it, and it was like how I followed you in the first place.
Yes. So I think I'm most famous for Homebrew, and then second most famous for this Google tweet. I think it was 2015. Yeah. And I had this really cushy situation where I was teaching iPhone development at one of these boot camps that were very common at the time, 20 hours a week. And I got to spend the rest of my time working on open source. And like the 20 hours a week I was working was good enough for a salary for me. And I really enjoyed it. Love teaching. I'd love to do it again. There's something, I think open source maintainers, developers, like there's something about teaching that just resonates. As aspects of it which personality matches up. But yeah, anyway, they had to let me go because they said I was too expensive. Although I think probably with hindsight, I was also a bit full of myself. It's about 6 years after Homebrew. I have to say I was a bit arrogant. I
Yeah.
created Homebrew when I was 26, so you can imagine what it does to a 26-year-old's opinion of himself. Um, but yeah, so I didn't know what to do with myself. So my wife at the time said, "Why don't you reply to one of those recruiter emails that Google send you all the time?" So I was like, "Oh, yeah, sure, okay." I didn't think I wanted to work for Google, but I was like, "Well, let's see what happens, right?"
Right.
So I replied. The recruiter gave me a call. He said that he was skipping me past the initial phone interviews because, homebrew, as I say, open doors. I was like, okay, well, that's fine. But you do understand, I don't have a computer science degree, right? Like I was saying earlier, I've got a chemistry degree. Never did computer science, got into the industry via open source. Still think that's a great way to get into the industry instantly. Like I hire people who only have open source in their resume all the time. And he said, yeah, don't worry. We'll cater the interview questions for you. So, fly me there, get in the hotel, next day, get up. First of 8 interviews. I don't know how many of our
Mm.
audience have tried the Google interview process, but like, crikey, 8 interviews in one day. First interview was the one that the tweet was about. So she had me try and like do some graph structure on a whiteboard, and it's not the sort of thing I've ever really had to do before, right? Like I haven't shied away from computer science when it made sense for the work I was doing. Like I can do it. I just don't particularly enjoy studying these like data structures and
Right,
the
right. The
puzzles
things that
around,
you like theoretically like use every once in a while, but like whenever you need them, you then go figure out the solution to the problem instead of trying to memorize 100 things that you'll use probably once or twice in your career.
yeah, well, exactly. Like, I'm sure that if I knew them all, it would be slightly more useful, but it's just not enjoyable enough for me to do like that kind of studying. So yeah, like I struggled through it. I think I did an all right job of it, honestly. But yeah, at the end of the end, I was like, well, okay, let's see how the rest of the day goes. And I actually had some like much better interviews where people were testing me on the stuff that they knew I could do, like software architecture or
Mhm.
engineering large code bases or uh, making code that has a nice shape, has a good feel to it, like something that you can maintain and evolve and keep going. But yeah, like a couple of weeks later, they phoned me up and I didn't have the job. So in a moment of like sudden like rage,
Oh
because
shit.
like I said, I didn't really expect to get it after that interview, and also didn't exactly want it. But yeah, like after putting down the phone, I was like, how on earth could they not need me or find some use for me? Because I knew a lot of their engineers used homebrew. Like I'd seen the at google.com emails coming through with pull requests and support requests and all sorts of stuff. So I knew it was in use there. So yeah, wrote out the
Oh yeah.
tweet. At the time, I had like 600 followers, if that, right? Like I was basically relatively unknown still in Twitter, at least, anyway. So
Right.
wrote out the tweet. It was something like 90% of our engineers use homebrew, but you can't invert a binary tree on a whiteboard, so F off.
Yeah, yeah.
And like, obviously, I made up the 90%. I have no idea. I'm sure it was a reasonable percentage. I
That's
didn't
yeah.
expect anyone to see this tweet, but it went straight to the top of Hacker News and got like a ridiculous amount of attention. I was half an hour later, open up my phone and like I couldn't stop the notifications coming through of like retweets and likes and everything. At that point, I was like, maybe I should delete this. Because I didn't think it was that fair. Because when you read something like that, obviously you're
Right,
like, well,
right.
what the hell's wrong with Google? Like a bunch of idiots, uh, maybe even suspecting something malicious. Well, in reality, it's just that was their interview process, and like even though I did check before I went, they weren't gonna try and interview me with that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, that was the sort of thing they did. But yeah, it led to over 300 job offers from just about everybody
Wow.
else in the industry. I had emails coming in for weeks. Everything that was cool. They were like, "Hey, well, you can come here, and we'll give you an interview that makes sense for you, or no interview."
Yeah, yeah, just come and work because like you're we know you're capable. Like what are
Mhm.
we gonna ask you, at this point? Like obviously we're not gonna ask you to work on something that is completely different or off from what you've done in the past, but if it even like somewhat relates to any of the code you've written before, everything is open source. It's like it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go in and see what you're capable of. And I think like
Hmm.
that's what you see with a lot of these more bureaucratic hiring processes, that there's it's just a disconnect between the real world and what they think that they're looking for. They maybe get given like a job requirements document, and like they list all of these things, and therefore they're like literally asking like all these specific things as opposed to gauging for whether the person is just capable of getting the job done.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, well, totally. And like, especially now, I have a lot of sympathy. Interviewing's really hard. So I still feel bad about it. I never deleted it. It's kind of a part of software history at this point, really. And supposedly it did. I had some friends at Google at the time, and they said that there was big town halls about it. Like
Really?
they were discussing how their interview
Well, I'm glad
process
they
like
took it
clearly has
seriously at
issues.
least.
Yeah, yeah. So supposedly, had an effect on how they do interviews, but yeah, and like one of the job offers I got was from a different department at Google. They were like, "Hey, yeah, just come and work for us. We'll just tick the boxes and say you did the interview right." so,
Nice, nice.
so it's a big company, and yeah,
Yeah,
but
things
yeah, that.
happen. It's a really good story.
Mm,
Okay, so I guess like the next thing that I want to touch on then is you built one of the most successful open source projects in software history, and then you ended up not being able to maintain it because you couldn't essentially make the amount of money you wanted to make. So you kind of left as a core or the primary maintainer to then go into consulting, and then you kind of still help maintain it on the side. Is that correct?
yeah, I'd say for the first 2 years of Homebrew's life, like I was very, very dedicated to shaping it into what I felt it needed to be. I had a very clear vision about how I wanted the community to evolve and how I wanted the tool to evolve and what it should do and how it should be better than the other package managers I'd used. Like the reason I made a package manager is because I was just strangely fond of package managers. I went through just about every Linux there was, and like the main differentiator of Linux is by far is the package manager. Like realistically speaking, is there really any other kinds of differences? Like obviously they have different goals with how the Linux is shaped, but it's the packaging which does that. So yeah, I had a lot of experience with it, and we were using Mac at the company I was at because we had 6 apps we were developing: Windows, Mac, Linux, iPhone, Android, and there was a BlackBerry app as well, which was short-lived. And Mac was the platform, and I just didn't think the package managers on Mac were great. So one of my co-workers eventually challenged me to do something about it because I kept complaining so much about the state of package management on the Mac at the time. So I had a very clear idea about what I wanted it to be, and there was no way I was going to leave the project in any capacity until I felt that it was there and the community that I had built up was going to keep it there. And yeah, that totally is what I managed to achieve. Did about 2 years full time. Then after that, yeah, it was contracts and working on Homebrew when I could, and staying part of the governments and guiding it and like shaping the community that was there. Like open source is just so much about the community. You need the people to like basically have like a cult like adherence to the vision you create. Because if you don't do that, then the project just dies. There's nothing else to keep it running, right? There's no money behind it to prop it up. There's no marketing department that can subtly lie about the feature set so that people start coming in. And then once you have a certain user base size, then it can continue to propagate itself. If you don't shape the people that work on it and that use it and evangelize it, then yeah, it'll vanish. So I managed to get it to that point. I'd say 4 or 5 years in, I burned out. I just didn't have the capacity, the energy, the time, um, and I felt I got it to a good spot. So at that point, I handed it over to Mike McQuaid, who I'm pretty sure is still the main guy, although he keeps threatening to have had enough on it. He's still running it, and yeah, like it's done a great job with it. But yeah, I burned out, and it's a common story, right? As I say, I've spent the last 6, 12 months talking to hundreds of open source developers on really important projects, and almost every one of them is either on the verge of burnout or has burned out and then maybe gone back to it, or burned out and then the project was good enough so it's ticking over, but like nobody's really maintaining it properly. Like you get flyby pull requests, but no one's taking a real serious look, checking that, yeah, it works with new operating systems, new versions of things, new versions of frameworks and libraries that are dependencies. Also, like more importantly, the security side of things, which so often is an afterthought with open source, simply because where's the time? Where's the
Hmm.
time and support for that? Barely anything.
Yeah, I mean, okay, and which brings us to this discussion. So the disconnect that happened with you and that happens with so many people, but I think you're an extreme version of this, is that you build something that becomes wildly successful, but the amount of value that is created by that relative to what is being paid to the people that created that becomes massively, massively skewed. Now, if you had started from scratch and built this thing as a company, we see companies worth millions or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, even billions of dollars, that actually don't provide as much value as something like this, but they were built in order to bring in revenue, right? So the challenge with open source is like, how can we actually start figuring a way to tie in the amount of value created by a lot of this software and scale it to, like, as the project or as the product becomes more used and supporting more valuable software, how can we kind of have that value accrual come back down to the people building it or creating it? So a lot of things have been tried in this space. No one's yet been that successful. So I guess what you're building with T Protocol is essentially an attempt to solve that problem. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like it was about 2.5 years ago where I was once again in between contracts and wanting to work on open source full time, because it's just easily where I enjoy myself the most and provide the most value. You know, I've created probably 3 major open source projects in my time. Homebrew dwarfs them completely, of course. And so I looked once again to see if like anyone had figured out a solution that might work, and I didn't really find anything. Is the truth? Like nothing that seemed to change the fundamental idea that open source is just worthy of charity. That the most you can expect as an open source developer is to have to beg for people to donate and hope that some of these companies that make fortunes on top of it, have decent open source support departments, and they basically don't. And I came to the understanding that, yeah, it was the fact that we treat open source as something that's only deserving of charity that is the main problem with it. So I started looking deeper into things, and over that period, I came to the realization that we needed something that was radically new, and also that maybe the person who had to do it was me. You know, it was time to stop waiting around for someone else to try and solve the problem when we weren't getting anything that really changed that fundamental perception. So I hadn't really looked into what was possible with crypto in a few years. I've been paying attention to it like most open source people. We love new technologies and we love keeping abreast of them and understanding them. But I hadn't looked for a while, and I saw that Web3 was fundamentally capable of creating new kinds of economics. And that was a key insight for me, because open source is different, right? Like people try to support it with capitalism and it doesn't work, because fundamentally open source doesn't operate with a capitalist mindset. And people try to support it with charity, and that also doesn't work because charity doesn't seem to ever work. So we needed something which could map onto how open source works, which is highly meritocratic. It has to remain free. You can't change the fundamental properties of open source and then expect it to remain open source. I needed something that could just fix that one glaring problem, the sustainability of it, without transforming the other parts. So I approached some VCs and managed to raise a bunch of money. And so we've been building it for the last 2.5 years as a pretty interesting tokenomics model. I didn't really understand tokenomics fully when I started this, but I managed to pick up some really great people in the space who have like great understanding, really deep knowledge, and they've been in it for 10 plus years. And we had to develop something really quite sophisticated in order to make it so open source could be rewarded and sustainable, while simultaneously building out the system of economics so that there is some demand drivers, and there is a way to get that token to cycle through that system. So it's not just a faucet to help open source, but also essentially like a value ecosystem that recognizes how intrinsically valuable open source is. Like, it represents some percentage of the value of the entire software industry, is the truth of it. And we're like opening up ways for people who either understand the value of open source or just like take a look at T protocol and realize that what we're doing is building a way to represent the value of open source, and they can see that there's value there, and then they can participate in that. So yeah, we've been running testnet for how many weeks is it? 9 weeks, I think, at this point. And I think we're going to cross 1 million onboarded wallets today, actually. So
That's amazing.
yeah.
I'm very curious to know. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to kind of try to run through some of the more important pieces here. If I'm a developer, what does my user experience kind of look like in order to kind of leverage T?
Yeah, so if you're an open source developer and you have an open source project, then yeah, well, we got a really nice app, is the truth of it. Like, we went into this knowing that there's 2.2 million open source developers in the Web2 space. I'm not sure that that particular label makes sense here. While there's only like 30,000 in the Web3 space, right? So what we needed was a solution that developers that weren't that familiar with Web3 could still use. So we have this beautiful app that uses account abstraction and paymasters and like all the technologies we could to make it feel less like a Web3 app, more like a Web2 app. So you, as an open source developer, you can go to our site, t.xyz, register with your Google account, account abstractions, wonderful. Find your open source project, and then you can say whether or not it's you or multiple people who work on this open source project. Most open source projects are just one person, but for those that aren't, we wanted to have that baked in from the start. Very important that you can specify that this should be a project that's a multi-sig with a quorum of like 2 out of 3 or whatever. Then we generate a file for you called the T constitution, which is a YAML file. Now, you commit that to the repository, and it's that commit action that proves that you have some kind of ownership over that project, or at least you've been given, commit access. So you must be someone who we can trust to manage the treasury for the project. Then after that, that's it. We give you T token rewards every 24 hours based on the rank of your project. And this is a
Yeah,
key
I was
part,
going to
which
ask,
I
like, how
skipped
are the
over.
rewards distributed? And I guess you're going into that now. So it's by rank. Is there any rewards? Well, okay, how was the ranking system created? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so we call it proof of contribution, and really it was one of the fundamental insights I had when founding this project, was that open source has been building up a kind of reputation system since its inception. We got 25, 30 years of data in the package managers, where you, as someone who creates an open source project, you declare your dependencies like very early on, and you're saying that your reputation, the reputation of your project, is dependent on the reputation of your dependencies. So it's really great reputational data that's also very Sybil resistant, because you're not going to become a dependency of some important project unless you have value to that project. So if we know that this project's important, then all its dependencies are just as important, if not more important. And so we realized that this was similar to how Google PageRank works. So we adapted Google PageRank, built an algorithm, and so we rank all open source projects. We're ranking 5.5 million currently. Every 24 hours, it's dynamic, gets updated. Got an on-chain oracle that does this, and then publishes the T rank to the chain. We're using Base instead. I thought that was going to be a question at some point.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, that answers so much. Actually, pretty bullish on Base. Also, I like that chain.
Yeah, we love it. We love working with them as well.
Yeah, I bet they really love working with you too, actually, because I mean, when you kind of look at some of the focus of base that seems to be around consumer crypto, it seems to be around like real actual use cases, which
Mhm,
obviously this is. I guess the last question, and then we can wrap this up. You're coming from Web 2, I'm coming from Web 2. We obviously know that there are exponentially more developers in Web 2. How can we get them to start using something like this and showing them the value proposition without going into a lot of the details about crypto and stuff? Because people are just turned off by that, a lot of them. And if we can kind
mhm.
of somehow translate the UX to some type of value that they can then have without diving into a lot of the nuance and details around crypto.
Yeah, well, going into this, I knew that it was going to be one of the bigger challenges was appealing to developers who had already decried that crypto was just a scam and evil, and that they didn't want anything to do with it. And as a result, that's part of the reason that our app doesn't feel very much like a Web3 app. We don't talk much with Web3 terminology. It's quite easy to get into if you don't understand much about the Web3 space, while simultaneously allowing you to use your own wallet rather than account abstraction if you want, if you understand it. But what I found is, I didn't expect this to be true, but like most core open source developers have already dabbled in crypto. Like the people who work on really big projects, they're not anti crypto actually. They've been either part of it, maybe they you don't even know, but they have other projects which are already in the crypto space, or they mined a bit of Bitcoin back in the day, or or Ethereum or something, and they been paying attention. They haven't turned away from it. They see it as a tech, right? Just like email is a technology that we've all embraced, despite the fact that it's full of scams and phishing attempts. And frankly, my junk folder is 1,000 times bigger than my inbox in terms of the amount of emails I receive. We managed to find solutions that prove the utility of it, and that's what we're doing in the crypto space. So these open source devs are already, they're already on board. They don't have a problem with it, and they're incredibly influential people. So all of them, well, not all, I'd say 80% of the ones I've spoken to really want to evangelize what we're doing. They see how what we're doing has a real potential to be a different solution to their personal problem. Like they really want this to succeed.
Right. It's
So
like
they're already,
literally solving a big, huge problem, big pain point for them, unlike a lot of stuff that's out there.
yeah, exactly. So they're evangelizing us. They're going to stick something in their readmes. The TYAML file itself is obviously right there in everybody's faces, so people who go to GitHub can see it. But I can see people saying, "Hey, okay, I'm on T. I need you to stake against my project. If you want support, then you're going to get it. But I'm more likely to do it faster if you stake. And this is better than donations, right? One-time donations are meaningless. With our staking system, there's yield for everyone involved. Like there's continuous. That's what I'm saying when we're talking about like changing the narrative from charity to like a value
Awesome.
ecosystem.
That's
Everyone can
interesting.
participate.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the staking mechanism. As you can probably guess, pretty bullish on staking.
Yeah, like it changes that messaging like fundamentally. So yeah, the open source devs, they'll evangelize it, and devs that maybe have been turned off by crypto or not fully onto it. The thing I hear from them often is like that T is one of the first, or maybe the first crypto project they've heard of that makes sense to them. So I really feel that yeah, we got a good chance to convert a lot of hearts and minds with what we're doing. In the developer space anyway.
Nice. Well, this has been really, really helpful. I try to keep these about 30 minutes because short, concise, dive in and kind of go straight to the meat. I think we covered a lot. I know your time is extremely valuable, so I appreciate it. And if someone wants to learn more about T and get started using it or learn more about you, where can they find you and T online?
Yeah, so it's T.xyz, and that's TEA. Turns out it wasn't such a great choice of name in the respect that people have to ask you how to spell it. I was coming up with it in a hurry while founding the company, but we're good for SEO now. T Protocol on Twitter, and I'm MXCL pretty much everywhere, also on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, that wraps it up. Thanks for your time today, everyone. If you're watching this, go check out T Protocol, follow along, and see what they're doing. They'll be going to mainnet, I'm guessing, sometime. I don't know when, but
Yeah.
you can already sign up and start using the testnet, right?
Oh yeah, testnet's live. Sign up, earn some points, and we're going live with mainnet later this year, Q3.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll have more of these starting next week. Bye bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.